what is it that we're striving for when we do that? So there's several things that we talk about that would be really important and great when we think about question. So the first, so one of them is curiosity, and we'll see how well I spell curiosity. So is the question I'm asking creating curiosity among the people in the room? Will they be curious about it? You know, if I'm having a bunch of food providers in the room and I'm asking a question, how do we make sure that we don't have so much trash outside of our buildings? That may not be something they're necessarily curious about. They might be more curious about how are we going to continue to feed this ever-growing number of people. So there's something about understanding who you're inviting into the room and what is the question that they will be curious about. What is the question that you don't already have the answer for, so they'll want to be curious about, right? Because if they already know what you're going to do, they're not going to be really that curious about the question either, no matter how good the question is. So you want something that will get people's curiosity going. You want to have something that gets them excited and go, yeah, let's think about that. You also want your questions to be thought-provoking. So we find, particularly in our culture and in our world, that a lot of times, we just stay right at the surface of what we talk about. And so then we wonder, well, we've talked about this, why aren't we getting to solutions? But we kind of stay at the surface. And the question you may have asked me keeps me there. It doesn't challenge me to go deeper. It doesn't make me have to think outside my comfort zone or what I would normally be. And so, can I make my question thought-provoking enough that people are going to go, okay. And that's why, we said yesterday, if you ask a question and it's silent for the first 3 minutes in a cafe, that's actually okay. Because it's meaning people are having to think about the question. I don't have a ready answer. I'm not just downloading what I already know. But I actually have to think about that a little bit before I can find what might be how I want to answer that question. So we're not looking for who can answer the question the fastest. That's not what you're looking for when it's not a test and there's a right or wrong, but it gets people thinking about what they're looking at. We also want questions, and that goes along with thought-provoking, that allow us to be reflective about it. So, we're not talking about, again, when we're asking these questions, we're not driving to a certain answer that we already know. We want people to not only to be thought-provoking for them, but allows them to reflect about this question and what that means to them and what else it might make them think about. And so, again, it's a way of getting people to go deeper and think beyond what their normal answer would be to a question, like what just comes off the top of my head. What's the easy thing for me to say? Yes, I know that, this is what you should do. We talk about creativity. Kind of that newness. So, thinking about how we ask questions that evoke that. How we ask questions that will make people not just want to think about the normal answers. I was sharing with somebody yesterday, one of the things Tuesday I will do sometimes is, sometimes folks, they just really want to tell you what they know, which is always the stuff they tell you. So you can ask a question that says, so what are the ideas and actions we should take because of what's going on around us? And let them get out all the things they normally ask. And then in a second question say, okay, that's great. Now you can't give those answers anymore. Now, what are the things that we should be thinking about and actions we should take? So the question may not have changed, but you've allowed them in the process to kind of download what they already know and honor what they already know, but pushing them to think a little deeper about what they know and what else they could be. And so just in how you get to that creativity, because people will ask that a lot of times, how do you get people not to give you the same old answers they've always done? And sometimes it's not only about the question, but the process of the question and how you ask it to get there. You want the question to get their attention and help focus them on whatever the issue is that you're talking about. So you have to think about it in terms of, if I ask a question that feels so open-ended, I don't know if you're wanting me to actually respond to this about my community. Are you talking about my organization? Are you talking about the world, where you want me to go? So we wanted to have enough focus that I know kind of that context and the scope of where you want me to answer or what you want me to look at. And we wanted to grab their attention. So again, it goes back to being meaningful. So the question might be meaningful to me, and you all might not care about it at all. Like when I was listening, when we were talking earlier today with the group, and they were talking about all the dogs that were being euthanized. And I really care about that. I mean, that would really, but for some people, that would not be what would get their attention and bring them into, like, what could we do to stop all this? Would not necessarily be what other people may want to pay attention to. So make sure that whoever you're writing the room, that the questions can get their attention and can help them stay focused on the issue at hand, on the direction we want to go. We want questions that kind of stay with people. So one of the most exciting things I have found is when we've had a question in a room, and a week later I'll see somebody and they go, you know, I've been thinking about that question a lot. Like, it's really just stayed with me. And it's showing up in other meetings, and now we're asking other people. So it's not only that it stays with the individual, but it's also that it travels really well. So I can take that question and I can ask it of people in other organizations, or I might be able to ask it at different levels within my own organization. So often in our own organizations, we think that, so like at Honda, we may think that the questions I ask the leadership team are not questions I could ever ask the folks working on the line. They wouldn't, and that's not necessarily true. If you're asking a really good question, it probably can be answered by both. And it's interesting to see the kinds of answers, the differences, and the sameness in terms of the responses you get. So what's a question that will travel real well, that's attractive to more than just me, and that will stay with people? So we want to look at that. We want questions to take us forward, and we want and to create energy. So, you know, I always talk about, in healthcare, you know, we have lots of really funny things we do, but one of the things, whenever we would have some kind of disaster or big thing happen, you know, the first thing we'd do is say, we'd go into our post-mortem, and we'd say, what did we do wrong? And that just somehow doesn't give me any energy, and doesn't make me think forward, right? It makes me think about the past and everything we did, but it doesn't help me think about going forward, and it actually doesn't really make me want to talk to you at all, because what you're looking for is all the things I did wrong and things. But what are the questions we got that create energy, that get people really bubbling, get them talking? And you know, we noticed that yesterday in the cafes, how it got louder and louder and louder in here. Noticed it this morning in the check-in. It got really loud in the check-in in terms of people having fun. So the question created some energy, right? It created some energy for us. And so we want that too. We want to be sure, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. We want to make sure, we also want to think about how our questions kind of surface the assumptions that may exist. Because they, you know, when we start asking, the questions themselves can have assumptions in them, and we can have assumptions about certain topics and areas. So we may have, you know, assumptions we've made. You know, I think about the political scene right now. There's probably a lot of assumptions we all have in the room around that. And how do we ask questions that help us begin to surface those, to understand, you know, where is it we're really responding from? What is it we're really thinking about? What is it that I've assumed? Because it could be very different than what Laura has assumed in the conversation. And so as we're talking, if we're not surfacing those in, the question doesn't help us get those out, and we actually could really be responding to two different questions entirely in our thoughts. So how do we allow the questions to help us do this? How do we, how do we ask questions that lead us to more questions? So in the complexity that we're all working in, a lot of times it's not the first question that's actually going to answer the problem. And sometimes it's the other questions we will begin to surface around it that help us answer. And so when we do our planning, a lot of times, you know, we talk a lot of our work and working in emergence. And that doesn't mean, oh, I just don't plan for what I want to do next, and whatever I did comes up. But it does mean I have a plan for the work I'm going to do. But as we have our conversations, if there are more questions coming up that we really need to look at before we get to taking action, then how do we bring those forward into the work that we're going to do? Because a lot of times a good question will actually evoke more questions. Well, what if we thought about this, or what? And it's funny because in a lot of our planning process, we actually put that in there for folks. In their templates, we'll say, and what other questions do we have now? Because generally in that, as they're working and answering it, more are coming up, and that's absolutely okay. And then, which I like to leave this one last, because you got to think about all those things, right? And yet you want the question to be simple and clear. So, all these things doesn't mean you have a run-on sentence that's about 20 commas in it and all those things, but you do want the question to be simple and clear. And that doesn't mean you're leading people to an answer, and it doesn't mean, sometimes thought-provoking can feel unclear to people. So one of the questions we like to use a lot of times in cafes is, what time is it? So what time is it in our world? What time is it in our university? What time is it in our lives? And you'll get people really quiet for a minute, and they're going, well, are you talking about like actual time? It's 9 o'clock, or it's 5 o'clock? Are you looking? Well, however you want to answer it. So the question's pretty simple and clear. It's meant to be thought-provoking. So it doesn't mean, what time is it? And use actual numbers to let us know. Because now I've made it simple and clear, and not thought-provoking, where I have to think a little bit more. How would I really answer that question? Would I answer it more in terms of actual time? Is it more about just what's going on in the world? So in all that you do in doing all these things, we still want to stay as simple and clear as possible. And that's why when we develop questions, we'll work on them for a little while. So it's not like we come up with questions and say, okay, that's the question. We'll look at it, and then we may go, okay, well, what can we do? If I was answering that question, how would I answer it? And is that really the direction we're trying to go? Try it out on a few people. I used to try it on my husband all the time. If I ask this question, what does that mean to you? And, but try it out and test it. Because it's a lot to think about when doing it, but it will also help you move forward to make sure we're staying simple and clear. The other thing I want to talk about when asking questions, just really quick, because we're just going to let you practice for a little while around doing, is the construction scope and assumptions we make around questions. So when we talk about construction, it's how we're building the question. And so, the questions are who, when, why, what, where, how, which. So as you think about these, which of these would you say are more powerful? Like if you were going to put something at the top of the pyramid and say, this is really powerful if I start my question with a who, when, why, what, where, how, which. What would go at the top for you?
Wow.
Why and how? Any others you've put up there?
What?
Maybe what? Actually, like who better. What would you put at the bottom of the pyramid? What would be least powerful in this? Which? Which or a yes, no? Yes, no, which is a which question. And then in the middle, we can stick the wheres, the who, the when. So we encourage folks not to ask yes or no, because once you said yes or no or which, I don't know what we talk about now. Like, okay. I mean, sometimes you need to ask a yes or no question, absolutely, but if what you're trying to do is set up a conversation, if you ask that first, then it'll be a pretty short kind of conversation. The where, who, and when also kind of evokes us to, like, an answer. It's a little bit more. And again, sometimes the wheres can do a little more powerful. The why, hows, and whats get us really, like, feel a little more curious. Like, what would we do if we wanted to create an environment that that had clean air? What would we do if we really want an environment clean air? Which is different than, do you think we should have an environment that has clean air? So just evoking. So you want to think about the construction. What are the words I'm using to ask my question and how? So we want to think about that. We want to think about scope. So am I asking, do I really want to know how can we change the economics of our organization? How can we change the economics of the world? How can we change the economics of my department? But thinking about that scope of what am I asking that question, the scope that I'm asking the question in. And it's about, and it works both ways. Sometimes I think we think about scope, well, I don't want to ask some people a question that's about the world because they may not want to answer. But I also don't necessarily want to ask my upper management, I may not want to ask them, how should the staff do their job better? Because they may not have the right scope to do that too. So it works in both directions when you think about scope. But think about who's in the room and what they can do. Because if you're asking people questions they can't really influence or feel like they're going to see their DNA on, they're going to be less likely to want to actually engage in that conversation. It's got to be something that's meaningful to them if you go back to all those words we used. And so what's the right scope that will be meaningful to the people who are in our room? I had a group who, they had to cut $2 million out of their budget. And they were losing funding. It wasn't going to come from any place else. And so there are some people who say that's a question we take to our leadership team. That feels like that's the right scope. She felt this is the scope for our entire group. And so I give her a lot of credit during Experience Open Space. She had an open space about what are the ideas and things we can do to take $2 million out of our budget because she felt that was the scope of the, and there's some discernment there. Maybe that wouldn't be for every organization, but for hers it was, and she was brave enough to, because one of the ideas was we need to cut our levels of management. And so, but think about that in terms of the scope that you're asking it. And then we talked a little bit about assumptions, but every question has an assumption. So if I say to you, so what should we do to improve our relationship? I'm making an assumption our relationship needs improvement, right? And it's not that questions don't have those assumptions in them, but it's just that we need to be aware of them. And sometimes we want to talk about them and how we frame. Because that's another piece that's really important. When asking questions in cafes or whatever circumstance we're in, we try to frame them up. So it's just not, oh, here's your next question, now go answer that. But what's some of the framing behind it? And some of that may include some of the assumptions that we make. We're making an assumption you want to change. We make an assumption, how can we do our work differently? Well, we've made an assumption you want to do our work differently. In the homelessness program, we were really careful about that because we were asking people, this last time around, we were going to totally kind of blow up the system and change it. And what our assumption was not that people were doing things wrong. But the assumption we made was the increased need, the decreasing money, we could not sustain. So it's really important to explain it, because if we just went in and say, so what can we do that's totally different, people are going to assume because you don't like what we're doing now. You don't like what we're doing. And so there's just something about the assumptions are there, you just want to give some explanation behind them. So you want to think about the construction scope and assumptions of the questions, and you want, while you're keeping it simple and clear, think about how you're creating energy, interest, excitement, how you're moving people forward in it. We haven't talked a lot about appreciative inquiry, which is a whole nother process, but we do try to use in terms of how we ask questions to have them be more appreciative, so moving people in the direction, in that direction rather than staying where we've been. Like if I ask you what's wrong with our system, we'll just, churn about what's wrong. Sometimes we do need to ask that because there's healing that needs to happen. We just need to be accountable and recognize what we own. But it's not always where, if we will stay there if we don't have another question that now moves us forward and takes us someplace else. And so it's thinking about all of those things when we put questions together, which I know is a lot. Any questions before I?
So when you write a